Hello everyone, this is your host Nandini Ray and you are listening to the Maitri podcast Between Friends Conversations with Maitri. Today, we welcome you to Policy Matters, a quarterly presentation from Maitri Policy Advocacy where we discuss public policies that shape the prevention, intervention and overall attention to domestic violence within our communities. In our presentation of policy matters, we are focusing on intersection of gun violence and domestic abuse.
Now, we hear a lot about the tragedy, the horrific tragedy of mass shootings, including children who have lost their lives just going to school. One of the things that I don't think gets enough attention is how often children are harmed in the context of their own family. So domestic violence impacts children and youth within the context of their own family. We're talking about in 2022, just some more statistics, at least 866 kids ages 17 and younger were shot in domestic violence situations. 621 of them died. At the same time, 268 children were shot at school, 75 of them fatally. Horrific. Any loss of life, any harm and trauma that's resulting from easy access to firearms is completely intolerable. And we have to draw attention to this lesser known area where children are being harmed and unsafe in their own home. We also know that domestic violence isn't always taken seriously as a dangerous phenomenon. We spent decades treating it as a private matter to be resolved between the couple with separation, mediation, low intervention from the state. There's some advantages to that in the sense that people are often embarrassed and afraid, and advocates really push us to understand that survivors need to drive and shape the remedy. We can't just say state intervention is the best way to go. But when we don't take reported domestic violence seriously, the results can be deadly. And we see that with over 2/3 of mass shootings having some connection to domestic violence. So the Pulse nightclub incident, for example, his former partner talked about the level of violence and abuse she was subjected to. So over 2/3 of mass shootings connected to domestic violence means we have to do more to take domestic violence seriously, not only to protect that individual victim, children and family members in the household, but the community more broadly.
That was Julia F. Weber, renowned for her expertise in intimate partner violence and gun violence prevention, sharing her insights with a room full of youth and adult community members in 2024. The event was the Maitri Organized Youth Convention, an effort to engage the next generation with healthy relationship issues discussion. My name is Smitha Chandrasekhar. I am a graduate of the University of Washington and an incoming first-year medical student at the University of Southern California. And today we will be discussing the intersections of gun violence and domestic abuse. According to the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, 46,728 people died from gun violence in the United States in 2023. This means that on average, in 2023, a person died from gun violence every 11 minutes in the US. One social justice topic that remains as closely tied to gun violence as it did in 2012 with the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, in which the shooter first turned his weapon on his mother, killing her before driving to the school, is that of domestic violence. In as recent as 2024, an Indian origin couple and their child were found dead in a tragic murder-suicide. It was determined mother and daughter were the victims of the homicide, while the husband's gunshot wound was self-inflicted. This connection between gun violence and domestic homicides has demonstrated a continued intersection as years have gone on. In fact, according to April Zioli, PhD, an associate professor and the policy core director for the Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention at the University of Michigan. Approximately 68% of mass shooters, which is defined by the FBI as involving more than 3 victims, have a history of domestic violence and or domestic homicide, with the majority of mass shootings being domestic homicides. The substantial nature of these numbers makes the need for change in legislature surrounding gun control all the more prevalent, particularly in terms of access to firearms and more stringent reinforcement of gun control laws in order to protect everyone, especially those who are at higher risk of being the victims of gun violence, such as adolescents and domestic violence victims. In today's conversation, I am joined by Zakia Afrin, the director of the Survivor Advocacy and Prevention Program at Maitri, where we will discuss why gun violence is such an important policy issue to discuss and the intersectionality between it and domestic violence. Hello, Zakia. Thank you for joining me today and joining me to talk about Maitri.
Thank you, Smitha. As you already mentioned, gun violence is rampant in the United States. Even with the highest gun safety ranking by organizations that focus on the issue, California still has a long way to go in terms of addressing this. We know from research that women in abusive relationships are 5 times more likely to lose their lives in the hands of their partners who own guns. We also understand that it creates an atmosphere of danger in an unequal relationship and helps sustain coercive control over partners and spouses. For Maitri and other domestic violence organizations, we ask about ownership of guns by the abusive spouse at the very beginning of our conversation. This is a very important question for assessing lethality in a situation. The first issue when we discuss physical safety with callers reaching out is guns. And many times they simply don't know.
You mentioned that California has some of the strongest gun safety laws in the US. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, California has the strongest gun laws in the country and one of the lowest rates of gun deaths as well as gun ownership. It was the first state to pass a law funding gun violence prevention programs with a modest tax on firearm industry revenue, along with other innovative solutions to gun violence. California has background check requirements and many provisions to keep guns away from the wrong hands, including domestic abusers. Convicted domestic abusers cannot own a gun. Restrained parties cannot own guns and must turn theirs in to law enforcement after a restraining order is issued against them. On the same note, people who are convicted of hate crimes, stalking, and are considered a danger to themselves and society cannot own guns. Having said that, we understand that this effort to keep California safe from gun violence is far from over. Just last week, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a restriction from the state of Hawaii seeking to ban gun owners from carrying guns in private property without permission. Experts are saying this ruling may encourage challenges to similar provisions in California and in a few other states.
Thank you for that insightful response. I would actually like to quote a study now from Oregon State University that came out in 2024. It says, quote, in 2007 through 2022, women's gun ownership rose from 16% to 22%, while the rate of gun ownership for men stayed roughly steady at 43%. And more than half of new gun owners in the United States between 2019 and 2021 were women, end of quote. Why do you think these numbers are what they are?
Obviously, the gun industry creates the illusion very well that having a gun increases personal safety. Women are turning to guns for safety needs and many other reasons. For many, owning a gun is part of the American culture. The gun industry is especially focusing on women by visuals of confident, professional, and independent women practicing their targets. A similar situation while trying to promote female cigarettes. Thank goodness women have seen through that. And I also want to mention not just women. Minority groups are increasingly buying guns for protection. There have been reports of the Muslim community, particularly Muslim women, purchasing guns to keep themselves free from harassment. I don't know how we can all be safe at the same time be threatening to each other. It's more of an eye for an eye situation to me.
Based on all of the information you have provided me, it seems that the issue regarding gun violence and domestic homicide is extremely nuanced compared to what people may think. So, where do we go from here in this discussion?
Well, there is so much more to do. First of all, domestic violence with or without the presence of guns is unacceptable. Not just organizations like Maitri, community groups and individuals, all of us must understand the implications and come forward to address its eradication. Now, until we end all forms of violence, including domestic abuse, we need to continue to advocate for all these intersectional issues that make the situation worse, increasing the lethality factor. That is the reason we continue to include gun violence safety in our priority list for policy advocacy. Be it a California reform or nationwide, it affects us all. My specific call for the upcoming policy season to our community members is simple. Research your candidates before electing. See how they stand on gun laws. Vote for any measure that includes prevention efforts addressing gun violence. This can be monetary, educational requirement, and others. Speak out whenever you see our policymakers at any level are advocating on behalf of the gun industry. We are all in this together. Until every one of us is safe, safety is only a deception.
As you can see from this conversation, the intersectionality between gun violence and domestic abuse and homicide is much more exigent and nuanced than what is publicly recognized. We hope that this conversation has shed some light on this important issue and encourage you to consider what you can do in your community to combat the devastation that gun violence has on people's homes and communities at large. Thank you for listening.
Listeners, thank you for tuning in to the Maitri podcast Between Friends. Please don't forget you can find all our episodes on Maitri Bay Area's YouTube channel, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. Please like, share, and follow Maitri's podcast and social media pages and spread the word. And please visit our website, maitri.org.
This show is for informational purposes only and is not to be construed as legal advice. Always consult an attorney for legal advice. Views expressed by guests of the radio show are individual opinions and not endorsed by Maitri.